Hi, this is Paul Palmer. Today I want to talk about process mapping. Now, this is a skill that you can use for a lot of different purposes, but the one thing that I get asked about more than anything else is improving the quality management system. How do we make it better? How do we improve? How do we enhance the system? How do we make the system work better than it does already? And for me, there's one tool that everybody needs to understand. There's one tool that everybody should use is process mapping. Now, the most popular software to do it is Visio, of course. But Visio is expensive, so not everybody can afford it. Or, to be honest, not everybody needs it. Unless you're doing process maps all the time, you can probably use something like PowerPoint or Draw.io is another alternative. There's plenty of different tools that you can use for drawing process maps. You can even use a piece of paper, but it's hard work, especially if you want to change something. And if you are doing a lot, I do recommend Visio, even though it's expensive, because it actually reduces the time that it takes to create your process maps, because it's got the flexibility of moving the different boxes around. So as you can see in the one behind, you've got all the different structures, the different shapes. That actually, although it's a nice picture to have behind, some of the ways that they've done some of it's a bit poorly designed. But anyway, when you want to actually improve your process, or even when you want to document it in the first place, because that's the first stage. You need to actually write down your process before you even start. And if you've not documented or systemized your business, then process mapping is a good place to start. So how do you do it? Well, the first thing you've got to consider is what's the steps in your process. What do I do first? And usually people will miss the beginning. So they might think, well, we're going to move this from here to here, but they don't. Okay, no, let's talk about a better example, a real example. So you're going to supply some drugs, some pharmaceuticals. So where do you start? Well, people might think you start with manufacturing. So they think, oh, well, you order the materials. But they forget about the stage before that, actually planning and scheduling. And before that, you even need to do some sort of forecast. And it may be that you've got an order already. So if you start with the customer order, well, what's before that? Well, approving the customer, of course, because you have to verify that they're a valid customer. So if they're not on your system and you can't accept orders, then you don't even do that. So first thing, qualify your customer. So that's step one. Now that might have 3 or 4 different steps. And you do the step as a box, and then you do the documentation that goes with it underneath. And you look at whether the different parts of the process. Well, first of all, so you have to have an inquiry. And then what do you do? Well, you ask them for their license. What else do you do? Well, you ask them for the validity of their company. What else do you do? Well, you do a finance check. And what else do you do? Well, you take up their references if they provided some. And you make sure they're actually a viable company. And then you would go on to the UDRA GMDP, make sure that their license stacks up, make sure it's actually listed in the database, and make sure that their registered company actually is registered at Companies House. And all those steps can then have feedback loops, because if you have a failure at any point, you can see the diamonds in the picture behind me, the blue ones. So each time you do something, if something goes wrong, you've got a feedback loop and you go around the loop again. So actually, to actually start producing a product, even before you start, there's all these steps to go through. So now you've approved your customer. What's next? Well, you want to schedule the manufacturer. So you put it onto the plan. And what's needed when it goes onto the plan? Well, you have to make sure all the documentation's in place. Make sure you've got to have already had a license granted. So prior to that, it's got to have been applied. So there's so many different stages. And that's why it's really important when you're doing a process map, when you're building one, that you agree the scope. If you don't start with the scope, you're going to end up with a huge process map and you won't know where to finish. So start with the scope, go from the beginning, all the way through the process, start to end, then go from end back to the beginning. Because often you'll find that there's a different way that you could get there. And you'll find you've got several different options on the way through. And maybe you didn't consider some of the feedback loops that were needed to get there. And then you go from the front to the end and actually write down the details. You systemize it. You produce your standard operating procedures. And once you've done all that, you've mapped your first process. Okay, that's it for me for today. Talk to you soon. It's Paul Palmer.